Comanche called it the Comanche Moon, the full moon of September and October, when the plains grass was tall enough to feed their horses on long rides, and the nights were bright enough to travel by, and the isolated homesteads of the Texas frontier were lit up like lanterns against the dark prairie and visible for miles in every direction to men who had been reading this landscape since before the first settler ever broke the first acre of its soil. The settlers called it something else. They called it the Season of Terror. The specific 2-month window every year when the families on the outer edge of the Texas frontier did not sleep deeply and did not leave their children unattended after dark and did not hear hoofbeats in the night without their blood going cold in their veins. Because the Comanche came with the full moon. They had been coming for 200 years before the first American settler pushed onto the southern plains. They would come for 30 more years after. And in the specific dark hours between midnight and dawn, on the nights when the moon was full and the grass was tall and the homesteads of the frontier glowed pale against the dark earth of the Texas plains. They were the most feared fighting force in the history of the American West. Not the romanticized warriors of the movies, the real ones. The ones who could ride at full gallop hanging off the side of a horse with nothing but a heel over the animal's back and put 3 arrows through a man before he had finished drawing his gun. The ones who covered 40 miles a night across terrain that broke wagon axles and killed horses and simply ran through in the dark without slowing. The ones whose raids the United States Army, the most powerful military force on the continent, spent 40 years trying to stop and could not. Tonight, Pale Meridian brings you 3 true accounts from the Comanche Moon. A frontier family on the Texas plains whose homestead was hit on a September night in 1867 and whose surviving members left accounts of what happened in those hours that have never been fully told in any public forum. A young woman taken in a raid on a settlement in 1870, whose captivity lasted 4 years, and whose account of what she witnessed and experienced was recorded by a missionary in 1875 and is sat in an archive in Austin, Texas, largely unread for 150 years, and the account of a Texas Ranger captain who pursued a Comanche raiding party onto the Llano Estacado in the autumn of 1872 and found their camp, and found something in that camp that his official report described in language so careful and so deliberate that it reads like a man trying very hard not to say what he is actually saying. These are not stories about savages. These are not stories about heroes. These are stories about what happened in the dark on the outer edge of the American frontier when 2 civilizations collided with the full force of everything they were, and neither one was prepared for what the other was capable of. This is Pale Meridian, where the frontier ends and the darkness begins. Story 1. The night they came to the Cole homestead. The Cole family had been on their section of the Texas plains for 3 years when the Comanche came. 3 years of breaking the prairie soil and building the stone foundation house that Thomas Cole had promised his wife Margaret would be more solid than the soddy they had lived in their first winter. 3 years of the specific grinding hard work of frontier homesteading. The crops that sometimes came in and sometimes did not, the cattle that sometimes survived the winters and sometimes did not, the children who sometimes survived the fevers and sometimes did not. 3 years of making something from nothing on the outer edge of the Texas frontier in the specific way of people who have committed everything they have to a place and cannot afford to stop believing in it. They had 5 children. The oldest was 14. The youngest was not yet 2. Thomas Cole had heard the stories, of course. Every man who settled the Texas frontier in the 1860s had heard the stories. He was not a naive man, and he was not a reckless one, and he had made what he considered to be adequate preparations. The stone house with its thick walls and its heavy door and its rifle loops cut into the walls at adult height, the rifle and the shotgun and the ammunition stored in the specific places Margaret knew as well as he did, the horses in the corral close to the house so they could be brought inside quickly if needed. He had made what he considered to be adequate preparations. He had not made adequate preparations. The Comanche came on the night of September 14, 1867. The moon was 3 days past full, still bright enough to travel by, still bright enough to see the pale stone walls of the Cole homestead from the ridge 2 miles to the northwest, where the raiding party had been watching the property since before sunset. Watching the lamp go out in the main room, watching the smaller lamp go out in the bedroom, watching the specific gradual settling of a household going to sleep. They waited until the household had been dark for 2 hours. Then they came down from the ridge. The first thing Thomas Cole heard was the horses. Not the sound of approaching hooves, not the warning he had been listening for in the back of his mind every night for 3 years on that section of the Texas plains. The sound of his own horses in the corral. A specific sound that he knew the way he knew every sound his animals made, and that was wrong in the specific way of animals that have detected a predator and are reacting to it in the particular terrified way of prey animals that cannot run because they are enclosed. He was out of bed before he was fully awake. He had the rifle in his hands before his feet found his boots. Margaret was awake behind him. She did not ask what was happening because she had been listening to those horses for 3 years the same way he had, and she knew what that sound meant, and she was already moving toward the children's room. Thomas got to the rifle loop in the main room wall and looked out. The moonlit yard between the house and the corral was empty. The corral gate was open. His horses were gone. He understood what that meant. Every settler on the Texas frontier understood what that meant. The horses first, always the horses first, cutting off the ability to pursue or escape. And then, the door. The door that he had built from 3-inch thick oak planks and hung on iron hinges and secured with a bar that required 2 men to lift was the specific thing standing between his family and whatever was outside in the moonlit Texas night, and he moved to it and pressed his back against it and listened. Silence. The specific complete silence of the Texas plains at 2 in the morning that was not the ordinary silence of the night, but the specific curated silence of the prairie when everything that lives in it has gone still, because something is moving through it, that everything else has decided to get out of the way of. Margaret appeared in the doorway to the children's room, with the 2 youngest pressed against her, and the older 3 behind her, and the shotgun in her right hand, and her eyes asking him a question that he answered by pressing harder against the door. They stayed like that for what Thomas Cole later estimated was 40 minutes. 40 minutes of the specific held-breath terror of people waiting for something to happen that has not happened yet, and that every instinct they possess is telling them is coming. It did not come through the door. It came through the roof, not dramatically, not with the specific explosive violence that the word attack suggests, carefully, methodically, with the specific patient engineering of men who had been breaching frontier structures for 200 years and had developed approaches to every kind of construction the settlers built. The sod and timber roof of the Cole homestead's rear room, the room that Thomas had not yet gotten to reinforcing with the stone he had been cutting all summer, gave way section by section under the weight and the leverage of men working from above in the dark and the quiet. The first Cole child through the hole in the roof was the 14-year-old daughter. Her name was Sarah. She did not go quietly on her father's account, recorded 3 weeks later by a circuit preacher who visited the Cole homestead and wrote down what Thomas told him in the specific, careful handwriting of a man who understood he was recording something important, describes the sound she made as she went through that hole as something he would hear for the rest of his life every night before he went to sleep. He was right. He heard it for the rest of his life. The raid lasted 11 minutes from the breach of the roof to the sound of hooves departing to the north. In 11 minutes, the Comanche raiding party had taken Sarah Cole and 2 horses that Thomas had not known were still on the property, and a quantity of supplies from the rear room, and had departed into the Texas night with the specific efficiency of men conducting an operation they had planned and executed many times before. Thomas Cole broke through the compromised roof section from below 20 seconds after the sound of hooves faded. He was in the yard with the rifle before the dust had settled. He fired twice into the dark in the direction of the hoofbeats, and both shots went into empty night because the raiding party was already beyond accurate rifle range, and moving at a pace that his remaining horse, one elderly mare that the Comanche had apparently considered not worth taking, could not match. He stood in the moonlit yard of his homestead, in his bare feet, and listened to the hoofbeats fade into the Texas plains until there was nothing left to listen to. Margaret found him there 20 minutes later, still standing in the yard, still listening to nothing. Sarah Cole was 14 years old. She was gone into the Comanche Moon. The Texas Ranger Detachment that responded to Thomas Cole's report rode out the following morning and followed the trail north for 2 days before losing it in the breaks of the Canadian River, where the Comanche raiding parties dissolved into the landscape with the specific practiced invisibility of people who had been disappearing into this terrain since before the Rangers existed. They found no trace of Sarah Cole. The circuit preacher who recorded Thomas Cole's account noted at the end of his entry that Thomas had asked him one question that he could not answer. Thomas had asked him how long it would take, how many days riding north into the territory, before Sarah was far enough away that she could not hear her family if they called for her. The preacher wrote that he told Thomas he did not know. He wrote that he suspected Thomas already knew the answer and had asked the question anyway because some part of him needed to say it out loud to someone who would write it down. The answer was 2 days. After 2 days riding north into the Comanche territory, Sarah Cole was beyond any distance that a voice could carry. She was 14 years old, and she was beyond the sound of her family's voices 2 days after she went through that hole in the roof. What happened to her after that is the subject of the next story. What do you think Thomas Cole did with the rest of his life on that section of the Texas plains? And do you think he ever stopped listening at night for the sound of horses that were no longer in the corral? The Comanche Moon rose over the Texas frontier for 30 years, and in those 30 years, it illuminated scenes that the history books have never fully described, and that the survivors of those scenes carried for the rest of their lives in the specific silent way of people who have experienced something that the language available to them is not adequate to contain. The next story is about what happened to the ones who were taken, told for the first time from the account of a woman who survived it and lived to describe it to a missionary in Austin, Texas in 1875, and whose words have been in an archive ever since, waiting for someone to read them. Story 2. What happened to the ones who were taken? Her name in the archive is listed only as E. Hartwell. The missionary who recorded her account in Austin, Texas in the spring of 1875 used only her initial and her married name at her specific request, because she was living in Austin by then with a husband who knew the broad outlines of her 4 years of captivity and did not know the specific details. And she had decided that the specific details were not something her husband needed to carry, and that the missionary's archive was a better place for them than her marriage. She had been taken in a raid on a small settlement in North Texas in the spring of 1870. She was 19 years old. She had been married for 8 months to a man named Hartwell, who was away from the settlement on the day of the raid driving cattle to Abilene, and who came back 4 days later to a settlement that had been hit in his absence, and a wife who was gone into the Comanche territory, and a choice about what to do next that he apparently spent very little time deliberating over. He went after her. He did not find her. The Rangers he rode with did not find her. The Army detachment that eventually took over the search did not find her. For 4 years, nobody found E. Hartwell, and the reasonable assumption among the people who had known her was that she was dead, that the raid that had taken her had also killed her somewhere in the vast, dark interior of the Comanche territory, where the bodies of people who died stayed where they fell because there was no one to bring them home. She was not dead. She appeared at Fort Richardson in the spring of 1874, 4 years after the raid, walked into the fort on a Tuesday morning in April wearing Comanche clothing and carrying a child of approximately 2 years old, whose father she did not name to the soldiers who received her, and whose existence she described to the missionary in terms that were the most carefully worded section of his entire account of their conversations. She was 23 years old. She was physically healthy by the assessment of the fort surgeon who examined her. She spoke fluent Comanche and had largely lost her English in the 4 years of its disuse, and relearned it over the weeks following her return with the specific halting difficulty of someone reclaiming a language they had buried. The missionary who eventually recorded her account met her 18 months after her return to Austin. By then, her English was fully recovered, and her husband, who had waited 4 years and had not remarried and had come to Fort Richardson when word reached him that a white woman had walked in, had taken her back without the specific questions that would have required specific answers, and they were living quietly in Austin in the specific, careful way of two people who have agreed without explicitly agreeing on the dimensions of what they are not going to discuss. She told the missionary she wanted to describe what she had seen because she believed it was important that someone who could write it down should have it recorded somewhere, even if it was never read. She said she was not going to describe certain things that had happened to her personally, because those things were hers and she was keeping them. But she was going to describe what she had witnessed, because the witnessing of it was different from the experiencing of it, and the witnessing could be shared. She described the Comanche camp in the winter of 1870 to 1871, her first winter in captivity, in terms that the missionary recorded with the specific, careful language of a man who is writing down what he is being told and is trying not to editorialize. She described the camp as more organized and more sophisticated than anything she had been prepared for by the accounts of Comanche life that she had encountered before her capture. Not the chaotic, violent encampment of the frontier mythology, but a functioning community of several hundred people with its own social structures and hierarchies and customs and internal politics that she spent months beginning to understand before she understood enough to navigate. She described the warriors who had conducted the raid on her settlement. She had seen them close enough on the day of her capture to recognize several of them subsequently in the camp as neither the monsters of the settler accounts nor the noble savages of the Eastern Romantic tradition, but as men. Specific individual men with specific individual personalities and histories and relationships, and the specific mixture of qualities that actual human beings possess rather than the flat categories that the frontier mythology had assigned to them. She described watching a raid preparation in the autumn of 1871, the second Comanche Moon of her captivity. The specific rituals and preparations that preceded a raid, the way the warriors prepared themselves and their horses in the days before departure. The specific atmosphere of the camp in those days, which she described as a combination of focused purpose and something else that she spent a long time trying to find the right word for before settling on the word sacred. She said the raids were not conducted as acts of random violence or opportunistic theft, but as something that the Comanche understood in a framework that she had spent 4 years beginning to comprehend, and that she was not going to reduce to a simple description because the reduction would make it false. She described the return from raids, the specific atmosphere of the camp when the raiding parties came back, what they brought with them, the horses and the supplies, and occasionally the captives, other white women and children she encountered during her 4 years, whose fates she described with the specific, careful accounting of a witness who understands that she is the only person who will ever record what she saw. She described a girl of approximately 14 who was brought into the camp in the autumn of 1871, the Comanche Moon of that year. Dark hair. Frightened in the specific acute way of someone who has been frightened continuously for long enough that the fear has become the baseline state rather than a response to specific stimuli. The girl did not speak to her at first, and she did not press because she understood from her own experience that there was a period after capture when speech was not available, when the specific shock of what had happened occupied all the space where language usually lived, and there was nothing to do but wait for it to recede enough that words became possible again. The girl's name was Sarah. Hartwell did not write the surname in her account to the missionary. She may not have known it. She may have known it and chosen not to record it for reasons that the missionary either did not ask about or did not record. But she described the girl, the 14-year-old dark-haired girl brought into the Comanche camp in the autumn of 1871, in enough detail that Thomas Cole, if he had ever read the missionary's archive, would have known immediately who she was describing. She described her as alive. She described her as changed in the specific way that 4 years of captivity on the southern plains changes a person, not broken, not destroyed, but transformed in ways that made the girl she had been before the roof came apart above her on a September night in 1867 into something that existed now only in the memory of a family on a section of the Texas plains who listened for hoofbeats in the night and would listen for the rest of their lives. She described her as having learned to ride. She described her as having learned the language. She described her as having stopped looking south. Hartwell left the Comanche camp in the spring of 1874. She described the circumstances of her departure to the missionary in terms that were the second most carefully worded section of his account, and that suggests the departure was not entirely voluntary and not entirely involuntary, and that the truth of it was somewhere in the complicated territory between those two things that the language of 1875 did not have adequate words for her. She did not know what had happened to Sarah after she left. She did not know if Sarah was still in the camp or had been moved to another band, or had been traded, or had chosen to remain, or had been given the opportunity to choose. She described not knowing as one of the things she carried out of the territory with her, along with the child and the Comanche clothing and the fluent command of a language that her husband did not speak, and that she used less and less as the years in Austin accumulated and the distance from the territory grew. What she did not take with her, what she described to the missionary as the specific thing she had decided to leave in the territory when she walked out of it, was the framework she had spent 4 years building for understanding what she had witnessed. She said, "I understood it while I was there. I've been trying to forget that I understood it ever since. Some things are safer not to understand." She did not elaborate. The missionary recorded the sentence and added no comment of his own. The archive in Austin holds the account in a folder with a handwritten label that gives only the date and the initial and the surname. Hartwell, 1875. What do you think she understood about the Comanche Moon that she spent the rest of her life trying to forget? And what do you think Sarah Cole decided when she stopped looking south? Some things the frontier took, it kept, and some of the things it kept chose to stay. The final story tonight is about a Texas Ranger captain who rode into the Comanche territory in the autumn of 1872 and found a camp, and found something in that camp that his official report described with the specific careful language of a man who has seen something he cannot explain and has decided that the official report is not the place to try. Story 3. What Captain Ford Found. His name was Captain James Ford, and he had been a Texas Ranger for 11 years when he led the detachment into the Llano Estacado in October of 1872. 11 years meant he was not a man who frightened easily or who was given to the kind of frontier superstition that colored the accounts of less experienced men. 11 years of ranging the Texas frontier had given him a comprehensive and unsentimental education in what the southern plains could produce in the way of violence and hardship and the specific dark surprises of a landscape that had been killing people who underestimated it since before Texas was a state. He was practical and experienced and not given to exaggeration in any account he had ever filed in 11 years of service. His report from October 1872 is the most unusual document in the Texas Ranger Archive. The detachment rode out in pursuit of a raiding party that had hit 3 homesteads in Palo Pinto County in the last week of September. Standard response to a standard situation by the standards of 1872 on the Texas frontier. 12 Rangers following a trail north and west into the Llano Estacado with the specific professional focus of men who have done this many times and who understand the specific calculus of pursuing Comanche raiders onto the staked plains. The terrain favors the pursued, the distances are enormous, the water sources are known to the Comanche and largely unknown to pursuers, and the smart decision is usually to follow until the trail goes cold and then turn back rather than commit to a pursuit that the territory itself will end on its own terms regardless of the ranger's intentions. Ford's detachment followed for 4 days. On the evening of the 4th day, they found the camp. Not the raiding party's camp, or not only that, a larger camp than a raiding party would produce. Ford estimated between 40 and 60 people when he observed it from the ridge above the canyon where it was situated in the last light of the October afternoon. Families, not just warriors. The specific layout of a winter camp rather than a temporary raiding base, the arrangement of the teepees, the horse herd, the organization of the camp space suggesting permanence rather than transit. Ford watched the camp from the ridge for 2 hours before the light failed, He noted the number of warriors he could identify. He noted the horse herd and its size. He noted the positions of the sentries, and he noted something else that he spent considerable effort describing in his report, and that the report's recipient, the Ranger Adjutant General in Austin, apparently found significant enough to preserve, but confusing enough not to forward to any higher authority. At the center of the camp, in the specific location that Ford had learned from 11 years of observing Comanche camps was reserved for the most significant ceremonial activities. There was a structure he had not seen before in any camp he had observed, not a teepee, something lower and wider and constructed from materials that the distance and the failing light prevented him from identifying with certainty. Surrounding it at a radius of approximately 30 feet were a series of objects placed in the ground at regular intervals that he described as poles, but acknowledged might have been something else that the distance made look like poles. The activity around this structure was different from the activity in the rest of the camp, in a way that Ford found difficult to describe precisely, but that he characterized in his report as purposeful, in a way that the ordinary activity of a camp, cooking, tending horses, the movement of daily life, is not purposeful, directed, as if the people moving around that central structure were oriented to it the way compass needles are oriented to north, not because they were choosing to face it, but because something in them was responding to something in it. Ford's report describes what happened at full dark in language that I am going to read to you directly, because I do not think paraphrasing it serves the account. He wrote, "At full dark, the activity around the central structure ceased entirely, and for a period of approximately 1 hour, the camp was quiet in a manner I have not previously observed in any camp of any kind in 11 years of ranging. Not the quiet of sleep, not the quiet of watch being kept, a different quality of quiet that I find I cannot describe adequately, except to say that it was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that displaced sound, the way a large object displaces water. At the end of this period of quiet, a sound began from the direction of the central structure that I will attempt to describe, though I am aware the description will be inadequate. It was rhythmic. It was not drum or voice or any instrument I have encountered. It continued for a period I estimated 2 hours. My men heard it. None of them spoke during the 2 hours it continued. When it stopped, the camp resumed its ordinary activity as if nothing had occurred. I ordered the detachment to withdraw at that time, and we rode through the night and did not stop until dawn." Ford's report continues for 3 more pages describing the tactical situation, the assessment of the camp's defensive position, the recommendation for a larger military response, the specific details that an official ranger report is supposed to contain. All of it is written in the specific, clear administrative language of an 11-year experienced ranger filing a standard tactical assessment. Except for 1 more paragraph at the end of the report that sits between the tactical recommendations and Ford's signature, like something that he added after he had written everything else, and that he apparently decided needed to be in the record, even if he was not certain what it was doing there. He wrote, "I have filed this report as a tactical assessment, because that is what the situation requires. I want to add for the record that the 2 hours during which my detachment lay on the ridge above that canyon were the most disturbing 2 hours of my 11 years of ranging, and that I have not been able to fully account for them to myself in the 3 weeks since they occurred. I am including this observation not because I believe it is professionally relevant, but because I believe it is true, and I have found in 11 years that the things which are true have a way of being relevant eventually, whether or not their relevance is immediately apparent." Captain James Ford, October 1872. The military response that Ford recommended was dispatched the following spring as part of the Red River War of 1874, the campaign that finally broke the Comanches' hold on the southern plains and drove the last free bands onto the reservation, at the cost of the specific destruction of everything the Comanche had been on the southern plains for 200 years. The canyon where Ford's detachment had observed the camp in October 1872 was searched during the Red River War campaign. The camp was gone. The canyon was empty. The central structure was gone. The objects Ford had described as poles were gone. The only thing the soldiers found was a circular area at the center of the canyon floor where the ground was bare, the grass pressed outward from the center the way grass is pressed when something large has rested on it for a sustained period, and where the earth was warm in a way that the October temperature of the Llano Estacado could not account for. The officer who noted this in his field report described it briefly and moved on. He had a campaign to run, and a people to defeat and warm earth in an empty canyon was not something that the United States Army's operational priorities in October 1874 had a category for. But Ford's report was already in the archive in Austin, and the warm circle in the canyon was in the field report. And if you put those two documents side by side in the archive and read them in sequence, the specific thing they are describing together, across 2 years and 2 different observers and 2 different sets of professional responsibilities, is something that neither document names directly, and that both documents circle around with the specific careful language of men who have seen something they cannot explain and have decided that the official record is the only place they are going to put it. Ford lived until 1891. He filed hundreds of reports in the years after October 1872. None of them contained a paragraph like the one at the end of his October 1872 report. He never explained why he had written it. He never referred to it in any subsequent document that has been found. He wrote it once and left it in the archive and rode back out onto the Texas plains and kept ranging for 19 more years, and apparently decided that one paragraph was the right amount of the truth to put into the official record. What do you think Ford's detachment heard from that ridge for 2 hours in October 1872? And what do you think the Comanche had been doing in that canyon with the warm earth at its center? This is Pale Meridian. 3 accounts from the Comanche Moon. Thomas Cole, standing in his moonlit yard, in his bare feet listening to hoofbeats that were already beyond hearing, carrying his 14-year-old daughter north into the territory. E. Hartwell, in the missionary's office in Austin in 1875, describing what she had witnessed in 4 years of captivity with the specific careful language of a woman who had decided what she was going to say and what she was going to keep, and who said that some things are safer not to understand. And Captain James Ford on a ridge above a canyon on the Llano Estacado in October 1872, listening to something for 2 hours that his 11 years of frontier experience had not prepared him for, and filing a report that sits in the Texas Ranger Archive with 1 paragraph in it that does not belong to the same document as the rest of it, and that nobody has ever adequately explained. The Comanche Moon rose over the Texas frontier for 30 years, 200 years before the first settler broke the first acre of the southern plains. The Comanche had been reading that landscape in the dark. They knew things about it that the settlers never learned, and that the Army never learned, and that the Rangers mostly never learned. Ford learned something in October 1872. He put 1 paragraph of it in the official record and kept the rest. Some things are safer not to understand. Subscribe to Pale Meridian for new frontier horror every single week. Leave a comment telling me which account stayed with you. Thomas Cole in the yard, E. Hartwell's archive, or what Ford heard from the ridge. And if your family came from the Texas frontier, if your ancestors were settlers or rangers, or if the Comanche blood runs in your family and you carry stories from the other side of the Comanche Moon, leave them below. We want to hear all of it. Good night, and listen to the dark, because the Comanche Moon is still rising over the southern plains every September and October, and some things that learned to move through that landscape in the dark 200 years ago did not stop moving through it just because the frontier closed.